On the evening of January 27th, 1984, Michael Jackson was filming a commercial for Pepsi at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. It was supposed to be a routine shoot, the kind of thing he had done dozens of times before. The stage was set, the pyrotechnics were planned, the crew was ready. Jackson, at the height of his fame following the release of Thriller, was performing in front of a crowd of extras, recreating the energy of a live concert for the cameras. But within seconds, something went terribly wrong. A spark from a pyrotechnic device ignited his hair. Flames spread across his scalp. He kept dancing for a few moments, unaware that he was on fire. By the time someone rushed to extinguish the flames, the damage was done. That accident, lasting only a few seconds, would set in motion a chain of events that many believe led to his eventual dependency on prescription painkillers and his tragic death 25 years later. The Pepsi commercial was part of a massive endorsement deal, one of the largest in entertainment history at the time. Jackson had signed a $5 million contract with the company, and the commercial was intended to capitalize on the unprecedented success of Thriller. The album had become a cultural phenomenon, selling millions of copies worldwide and producing hit after hit. Jackson was not just a musician, he was a global icon. The Pepsi deal was meant to cement that status, aligning his image with one of the most recognized brands on the planet. But the shoot on January 27th was more complex than it appeared. The staging involved elaborate sets, choreography, and pyrotechnics designed to create a concert-like atmosphere. Pyrotechnics in the 1980s were less sophisticated than they are today. Safety protocols were not as stringent, and in the world of high-budget commercials, the pressure to deliver spectacular visuals often outweighed caution. According to reports from people who were on set that night, the accident happened during the sixth take of a particular sequence. Jackson was descending a staircase, surrounded by flashing lights and controlled explosions meant to simulate the energy of a live performance. The pyrotechnic devices were positioned on either side of the staircase, timed to go off as he moved down the steps. But one of the devices fired too close to his head. Witnesses described seeing a small flash, then flames spreading rapidly through his hair, which had been treated with a petroleum-based product to maintain its style. Jackson continued to perform for several seconds, either unaware of the fire or too focused on the choreography to react immediately. When he finally realized what was happening, he stopped and grabbed at his head. Members of the crew rushed to help, using jackets and hands to smother the flames. The entire incident lasted less than 10 seconds, but the burns were severe. Jackson was taken to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. The burns covered a significant portion of his scalp, reaching down to the bone in some areas. Doctors classified them as second and third-degree burns, the kind that require extensive treatment and often leave permanent scarring. He underwent immediate surgery to clean the wounds and begin the process of skin grafting. The pain, by all accounts, was excruciating. Burns of that severity damaged nerve endings, but in the early stages of healing, the exposed tissue is extraordinarily sensitive. Even the slightest touch, the movement of air, or the application of bandages can trigger intense pain. Jackson was prescribed strong painkillers to manage it. Those medications, primarily opioids, were considered standard treatment for burn victims at the time. No one on his medical team could have predicted that this initial prescription would be the first step toward a dependency that would shadow the rest of his life. The immediate aftermath of the accident was heavily managed by Jackson's team. Public statements emphasized that his injuries were not life-threatening and that he was recovering well. Pepsi donated the $5 million endorsement fee to a burn center in Jackson's name, a gesture that helped control the narrative and deflect potential criticism about the safety of the shoot. Jackson himself appeared in public relatively quickly, wearing a bandage on his head but otherwise seeming composed. He gave interviews in which he downplayed the severity of the burns, reassuring fans that he would be fine. But behind the scenes, the reality was far more complicated. The pain did not subside as quickly as expected. The healing process was slow and painful, requiring multiple surgeries over the following months. And the medications that had been prescribed to manage the pain were becoming something he relied on, not just for physical relief, but for the mental and emotional strain that came with the trauma. Opioid painkillers, the class of drugs Jackson was prescribed, work by binding to receptors in the brain and spinal cord, blocking the transmission of pain signals. They are highly effective for managing severe pain, which is why they are commonly used in cases of burns, surgeries, and other traumatic injuries. But they also produce a sense of euphoria, a feeling of detachment from physical and emotional discomfort. For someone dealing with the kind of pain Jackson was experiencing, that relief would have been profound. The problem is that opioids are also highly addictive. The body develops a tolerance to them quickly, meaning that higher doses are needed over time to achieve the same level of pain relief. And when a person tries to stop taking them, withdrawal symptoms can be severe, including intense pain, nausea, anxiety, and insomnia. For Jackson, who was already under immense pressure to maintain his career and public image, the idea of stopping the medication and facing that withdrawal would have been daunting. The timeline of Jackson's pain management in the months and years following the accident is not fully documented. Medical records from that period have not been made public, and much of what is known comes from secondhand accounts, statements from people close to him, and later legal proceedings. But several key details have emerged. Jackson continued to see doctors for treatment related to the burn injuries well into 1985. He underwent additional surgeries to repair the damaged tissue and reduce scarring. Each surgery came with its own recovery period and its own prescriptions for pain management. Friends and colleagues noticed changes in his behavior during this time. He became more reclusive, canceling appearances and spending long periods in isolation. Some attributed this to the trauma of the accident itself, the psychological impact of being burned in such a public and sudden way. Others began to suspect that something else was going on, that the medications he was taking were affecting him in ways that went beyond simple pain relief. By the mid-1980s, Jackson's reliance on prescription medications had reportedly become a pattern. According to people who worked with him, he began to seek out multiple doctors, a practice known as doctor shopping, to obtain prescriptions for painkillers and other medications. This is a common behavior among people struggling with dependency, as it allows them to access larger quantities of drugs than a single doctor would typically prescribe. Jackson's fame and wealth made this easier. He had access to private physicians who were willing to accommodate his requests, either because they genuinely believed he needed the medications or because they were reluctant to refuse someone of his stature. The line between legitimate medical treatment and enabling addiction is often blurry, and in Jackson's case, it seems that line was crossed repeatedly. The medications Jackson was taking during this period were not limited to opioids. Reports suggest that he was also prescribed benzodiazepines, a class of drugs used to treat anxiety and insomnia. Benzodiazepines, like Valium and Xanax, work by slowing down the central nervous system, producing a calming effect. They are often prescribed alongside opioids, particularly for patients dealing with both physical pain and psychological distress. But the combination of opioids and benzodiazepines is extremely dangerous. Both types of drugs depress the respiratory system, and when taken together, they significantly increase the risk of overdose and death. Jackson's use of these medications, according to later testimony from people who knew him, was not always medically supervised. There were instances where he self-administered drugs, taking more than the prescribed dose or mixing medications in ways that his doctors had not recommended. The physical toll of this dependency became increasingly visible over time. Jackson's appearance began to change in ways that went beyond his well-documented cosmetic surgeries. He lost weight, his energy levels fluctuated. There were moments during performances and public appearances where he seemed disoriented or unusually frail. Some of these changes were attributed to his demanding schedule, his perfectionism, and the stress of maintaining his career at the highest level. But for those who knew about his medication use, the signs of dependency were unmistakable. Friends and family members reportedly tried to intervene on several occasions, urging him to seek help or to reduce his reliance on prescription drugs. But Jackson, according to these accounts, was resistant. He insisted that he needed the medications to manage his pain, that the demands of his career required him to function at a level that would be impossible without them. The 1990s brought new challenges and new prescriptions. Jackson's career continued to thrive in many ways, with successful albums and tours, but his personal life was increasingly chaotic. The allegations of child abuse in 1993, the media scrutiny, and the subsequent legal battles added layers of stress that exacerbated his reliance on medications. He was prescribed additional drugs to help him cope with anxiety, depression, and insomnia. The list of medications he was reportedly taking grew longer, including sedatives, stimulants, and powerful anesthetics. One of the most alarming developments during this period was his alleged use of propofol, a powerful sedative typically used in surgical settings to induce unconsciousness. Propofol is not a painkiller and is not intended for use outside of a controlled medical environment. But Jackson, according to later testimony, began using it as a sleep aid, administered by private doctors in his home. This was an extraordinarily dangerous practice, one that would ultimately play a central role in his death. The medical professionals who treated Jackson during this period faced ethical and legal questions about their role in his dependency. In a normal patient-doctor relationship, a physician has a duty to act in the best interest of the patient's health, which includes refusing to prescribe medications that are not medically necessary or that pose a significant risk of harm. But Jackson was not a normal patient. He was one of the most famous people in the world, with the resources to hire and fire doctors at will. Some of the physicians who treated him have since been accused of enabling his addiction, prioritizing their relationship with a celebrity client over their medical responsibilities. Dr. Arnold Klein, a dermatologist who treated Jackson for various skin conditions, was later revealed to have prescribed large quantities of opioids and other medications. Dr. Conrad Murray, the physician who was with Jackson when he died in 2009, was convicted of involuntary manslaughter for administering the dose of propofol that killed him. These cases highlight the ways in which Jackson's dependency was not just a personal struggle, but a systemic failure involving multiple people who should have intervened. The psychological dimension of Jackson's dependency is harder to quantify but no less significant. Addiction is not just a physical condition, it is also a psychological one. For Jackson, the medications may have served multiple purposes. They relieved physical pain, yes, but they also provided an escape from the pressures of fame, the trauma of his childhood, and the relentless scrutiny of his adult life. Jackson had spoken publicly about the abuse he suffered at the hands of his father, the grueling rehearsal schedules, and the lack of a normal childhood. He had also endured years of invasive media coverage, tabloid rumors, and legal battles. The emotional weight of all of this was immense, and the medications offered a way to numb that pain, even temporarily. But that numbing effect comes at a cost. Over time, the drugs that once provided relief can become a cage, trapping the user in a cycle of dependence that is difficult to break. Jackson's attempts to address his dependency were sporadic and often unsuccessful. In 1993, he publicly acknowledged that he was struggling with an addiction to painkillers and entered a rehabilitation facility. He released a statement describing his dependency as the result of the pain from the 1984 burn and subsequent medical procedures. He expressed a desire to overcome the addiction and asked for privacy and support. The public response was mixed. Some people sympathized with him, recognizing the difficulty of managing chronic pain and the risks of prescription medications. Others were skeptical, viewing the statement as a damage control tactic in the wake of the child abuse allegations that had surfaced around the same time. Regardless of the public's reaction, the rehabilitation attempt does not appear to have been fully successful. Reports from people close to Jackson suggest that he relapsed after leaving the facility, returning to the same patterns of medication use and doctor shopping. The cycle of dependency continued through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. Jackson's career had its ups and downs during this period, with successful projects like the History album and tour, but also mounting financial and legal troubles. His spending was out of control, his debts were growing, and his health was deteriorating. There were multiple incidents where he was hospitalized for dehydration, exhaustion, or other ailments that were likely exacerbated by his medication use. Each hospitalization brought new prescriptions, new doctors, and new opportunities for the cycle to perpetuate. Friends and family members who tried to help him often found themselves shut out, Jackson was surrounded by a small circle of enablers, people who were either unaware of the severity of his dependency or unwilling to confront it. By 2009, Jackson was preparing for a series of comeback concerts in London, the This Is It tour. The concerts were intended to revive his career and solve his financial problems. Rehearsals began in Los Angeles, and by all accounts, they were grueling. Jackson was in his 50s, no longer the young performer who could dance for hours without rest. His body was worn down by decades of performances, surgeries, and the cumulative effects of his medication use. To cope with the demands of the rehearsals and his chronic insomnia, he turned once again to medications, including the propofol that would ultimately kill him. Dr. Conrad Murray, whom Jackson had hired as his personal physician, administered the drug in Jackson's bedroom on the night of June 25, 2009. Murray later claimed that he was trying to help Jackson sleep, that Jackson had begged him for the medication. But propofol is not a sleep aid. It is an anesthetic, and its use outside of a medical facility is highly dangerous. Murray's decision to administer it, and his failure to properly monitor Jackson after doing so, led to Jackson's death from cardiac arrest. The investigation into Jackson's death revealed the extent of his dependency. Toxicology reports showed that his body contained a cocktail of drugs at the time of his death, including propofol, lorazepam, and midazolam. The levels of propofol were consistent with surgical anesthesia, far beyond what would be considered safe in a home setting. The reports also indicated that Jackson had been using these medications for an extended period, that his body had developed a tolerance, and that the doses required to achieve the desired effect had been increasing. Dr. Murray was charged with involuntary manslaughter and convicted in 2011. The trial brought to light details about Jackson's final days, the medications he was taking, and the role that various doctors had played in enabling his dependency. But Murray was not the only one responsible. He was the last link in a long chain of medical professionals who had, over the course of 25 years, provided Jackson with the drugs that fueled his addiction. The connection between the 1984 Pepsi accident and Jackson's death is not a direct one, but it is undeniable. The burn he suffered that night was the beginning of a medical journey that introduced him to opioid painkillers, medications that are both effective and dangerous. The pain from the burn was real, and the initial prescriptions were medically justified. But the transition from pain management to dependency is a well-documented risk with opioids, and Jackson's case is a textbook example of how that transition can occur. Once the dependency took hold, it created a cycle that was reinforced by his lifestyle, his access to resources, and the willingness of doctors to provide him with whatever he requested. The accident itself was a moment of bad luck, a technical failure during a commercial shoot. But the consequences of that moment extended far beyond the physical injuries, shaping the rest of Jackson's life in ways that no one could have predicted. The broader context of prescription drug dependency in the 1980s and 1990s is important to understand. During this period, opioid painkillers were being prescribed at increasing rates, often without adequate consideration of the risks of addiction. Pharmaceutical companies marketed these drugs as safe and effective, downplaying the potential for abuse. Doctors, trusting these assurances, prescribed them liberally for a wide range of conditions. It was not until the late 1990s and early 2000s that the scope of the opioid crisis became clear, as overdose deaths and addiction rates skyrocketed. Jackson's dependency was part of this larger trend, though his celebrity and wealth gave him access to medications in quantities and combinations that most people could not obtain. His case also highlights the particular vulnerabilities of people in high-pressure careers who may turn to medications as a way to manage the physical and emotional demands of their work. The role of chronic pain in Jackson's life cannot be ignored. The burn from the Pepsi accident was just one of many injuries and medical conditions he dealt with over the years. He suffered from vitiligo, a skin condition that caused patches of depigmentation and required ongoing treatment. He had multiple cosmetic surgeries, some of which were reportedly painful and required recovery periods. He had back problems, lupus, and other ailments that were documented in medical records. For someone dealing with this level of chronic pain, the appeal of medications that provide relief is obvious. The challenge is finding a balance between managing pain and avoiding dependency, a balance that Jackson and his doctors were never able to achieve. Jackson's legacy is complicated by his struggles with addiction. He is remembered as one of the greatest entertainers in history, a visionary artist whose music and performances influenced generations. But he is also remembered as a tragic figure, someone whose life was marked by immense talent and immense suffering. The dependency that began with the Pepsi burn is a key part of that tragedy. It is a reminder that addiction does not discriminate, that it can affect anyone regardless of their success or resources. It is also a reminder of the responsibility that comes with prescribing powerful medications and the need for vigilance in preventing dependency. In the years since Jackson's death, there has been significant debate about who bears responsibility for his addiction. Some blame the doctors who prescribed the medications, arguing that they enabled his dependency for financial gain or out of a misguided sense of loyalty. Others blame Jackson himself, arguing that he made choices that led to his addiction and that he resisted efforts to help him. Still, others point to the systemic issues in the medical and pharmaceutical industries, the lack of regulation and oversight that allowed opioids to be prescribed so freely. The truth is likely that all of these factors played a role. Jackson's dependency was the result of a complex interaction between his personal vulnerabilities, the medical treatments he received, and the broader context of prescription drug use in society. The story of the 1984 Pepsi accident and its aftermath is not just about Michael Jackson. It is about the ways in which a single moment can alter the course of a life, setting in motion consequences that ripple outward for years. It is about the dangers of powerful medications and the ease with which they can become a crutch rather than a cure. It is about the responsibilities of medical professionals and the ethical dilemmas they face when treating high-profile patients. And it is about the human capacity for both resilience and vulnerability, the ways in which we cope with pain and the costs of those coping mechanisms. For those who knew Jackson personally, the memory of the Pepsi accident is tinged with sadness and regret. They wonder what might have been different if the pyrotechnic had been positioned differently, if the safety protocols had been more stringent, if the initial pain management had been handled more carefully. They wonder if there was a moment when intervention could have changed the trajectory, when Jackson might have been persuaded to seek help, or when a doctor might have refused to prescribe. But these are unanswerable questions, the kind that haunt anyone who has watched someone they care about struggle with addiction. The final years of Jackson's life were marked by a sense of desperation. He was deeply in debt, facing the prospect of losing Neverland Ranch and other assets. He was estranged from many of his family members, isolated in a world of his own making. The This Is It concerts were supposed to be his salvation, a chance to reclaim his place in the spotlight and solve his financial problems. But the rehearsals were grueling, and his body was failing him. The medications that had once helped him perform were now barely keeping him functional. And the propofol that Dr. Murray administered on the night of June 25, 2009, was the final link in a chain that had begun 25 years earlier with a spark and a flame. Jackson's death was ruled a homicide caused by acute propofol intoxication. Dr. Murray was held legally responsible, convicted, and sentenced to prison. But the broader questions about Jackson's dependency, the role of other doctors, and the systemic failures that enabled his addiction remain largely unresolved. There have been calls for greater regulation of prescription medications, for stricter oversight of doctors who treat celebrity patients, and for better education about the risks of opioid dependency. Some of these changes have been implemented in the years since Jackson's death, but the opioid crisis continues to claim lives, and the lessons of his case are still being learned. The 1984 Pepsi accident was a turning point, not just in Michael Jackson's life, but in the history of celebrity, medicine, and addiction. It exposed the vulnerabilities of even the most successful and talented individuals, the ways in which pain can become a pathway to dependency, and the failures of a system that should have protected him. It is a story without easy answers, a tragedy that unfolded over decades, shaped by choices both personal and systemic. And it is a reminder that behind the music, the fame, and the spectacle, there was a human being struggling with pain, both physical and emotional, searching for relief in places that ultimately led to his undoing.